screen yung dala namin. Inano pa doon sa may machine.
Okay. You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I can hang on.
Ito yung pasukin natin ito. Ang luwag pala. Sa labas ang liit lang ano. May screening pa ulit. Bigyan kami ng ito. Ayan si Manong. Antayin namin yung tour guide namin. Yan yung kasamahan namin. Nag-CR pa ngayon. Ang haba ng buhok ng babae.
Welcome everybody to the Alberta Legislature. My name is Allison and I'll be your tour guide today. As we go throughout the building, feel free to take pictures and ask lots of questions. I'll do my very best to answer all of them. Have any of you ever been to the Alberta Legislature before? First time for everyone? Yeah. Awesome. Is anyone visiting from out of town? Like everyone from Edmonton?
No, we are from Calgary.
Calgary?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm from London.
London? Oh, Ontario. Okay, welcome.
Vancouver.
BC? BC as well? And Edmonton? Okay, well welcome everybody to Alberta, welcome to Edmonton. We're going to start by heading up these stairs here, but at any point throughout the tour, if you'd rather take the elevator, there'll be one on either side. I'll let you know which floor we're going to. To begin, it's number 2, so you can take the elevator, meet us up there, or follow me up the stairs.
Akyat muna tayo. Follow daw siya. Follow natin. Ito yung sa loob na ang lalaki ng pundasyon nila. Grabe. Marmol na marmol lahat. Oh. Ito yung hagdan. Marmol. Wow. Si Manong.
Alright, welcome everybody to the main rotunda of the legislature. This space in this place where the Alberta Legislature is built has thousands of years of significant history. Long before Europeans ever came to this land, this very territory, next to the North Saskatchewan River, was used for generations by many different First Nations people. They met here to talk trade, discuss politics, and hold annual ceremonies. In Cree, the name for this place was Pahoning, which means meeting or gathering place. So as the fur trade progressed and the Hudson's Bay Company moved westward, they took notice of just how important this land was to people already living here, and eventually decided to build their 5th and final version of Fort Edmonton just south of where the legislature building now stands. And Fort Edmonton served as a trading hub for many years between the Indigenous peoples and the European fur traders. Eventually, Alberta became a province of Canada on September 1st, 1905, and they had to build a building to house the provincial government, so this location is the natural choice. And of course, this is the building that we're standing in now. The Alberta Legislature started construction 2 years after we became a province in 1907 and was completed by 1912. So in those intervening years, we had to find somewhere else to hold session. Alberta held its very first session. The building wasn't even complete. It was still under construction. All that was done was the chamber itself and the legislature library. So if you saw construction inside, maybe it looked something like that at the time. Now, the Alberta Legislature is built in the Beaux-Arts style, which is a neoclassical design popular in the early 20th century throughout the Western world and specifically in North America. So a lot of the legislatures built around the same time look kind of similar because they have similar influences. Our architect was from Rhode Island, so our...
Yan. Yung mga Canadian dyan, dapat makinig kayo dito sa sinasabi ng mga tour guide namin para may makulit po kayo.
And she married Canada's fourth Governor General, Sir John Douglas Sutherland Campbell. Now, it's said that when Sir John Campbell came out westward to the Rockies for the very first time, he saw our beautiful landscapes of the mountains and the prairies, and he said, I want to name this land after something just as beautiful as it is my beautiful one. So he went to the government at the time, but the name he suggested was not Alberta. He proposed the name Louiseland. And if you're thinking Louiseland is not a very good name for a province, doesn't have a very good ring to it, that's exactly what the government thought. They actually hated the name and wanted to reconsider. Eventually it was the princess herself who suggested the name Alberta, because not only would it honor her, but also her father, Prince Albert, who died when she was very young. And so that's why we're in Alberta and not Louiseland, and I'm thankful for that because I don't like the name Louiseland either. Alright, we have one more statue over here of someone else who was important. You feel free to just come this way. So this is the statue of Chief Crowfoot. He was chief of the Niitsitapi, or the Blackfoot Confederacy, and he signed Treaty Number 7 with the British Crown. In the 1860s, the way of life for his people was rapidly changing, and they needed someone who would be a strong negotiator and who could represent them to the Government of Canada. And Chief Crowfoot was chosen as he was a strong warrior and a great leader. And his statue here has some symbols to represent him. Like in his left arm, there's a pipe bag, which in Blackfoot culture would hold a pipe stem and tobacco, because it's similar to a handshake. They would give a gift when you first meet someone, as a sign of well-being, being open to working with them, and the gift would be the piece of tobacco contained in the pipe bag. So it sort of demonstrates the assembly.
Mga opisina yan. Mga opisina.
And if you watch your step on the stairs, they can be slippery because they are made of marble.
Dami namin. Dami namin. Galing kami dun sa baba.
Alright, so these are the main chamber doors. Behind here is the floor of the chamber where they hold session. Now, we're not allowed to walk through these doors because they're only used for a ceremonial procession at the beginning of each sitting day. But we will see the chamber from up above shortly. But these doors are original to the building, so they were hand carved back in around 1907, and they have a lot of symbolism to represent our province and things they'd hoped for our province at the time they were made. So at the top, there's the British crown, symbolic of our ties back to the British monarchy, traditions that we've gotten from them. There's a wreath here called a festoon to represent wealth and prosperity, because we're a very wealthy and prosperous province. Along the side, there's an ancient Roman symbol of strength and unity in government. It's called a fasces because it represents a bundle of sticks. So one stick by itself, very easy to break, but if you have a bundle of them together, they're a lot stronger. It represents the idea that you can achieve more when you work together. Now in the very middle of the doors, there's two brass knobs with a very important purpose. They have the letters AP, which stand for Alberta Parliament. And this is where the Sergeant at Arms will knock the black rod before the Lieutenant Governor can be admitted. We'll talk about the Lieutenant Governor shortly, but if she wants to enter the chamber, they first have to knock on the door with a large ceremonial rod, because as a representative of the crown, she has to get permission. So they always knock on these little knobs here. But if you look closely at the one on the right, it's dented in comparison to the one on the left. And this is because the Sergeant at Arms has traditionally been right-handed, so he always knocks on that side of the door with the black rod. So there's a little bit of a dent there, and not on the other, which I think is kind of cool. Ties back to British monarchy. The very middle is the Alberta Crest, so there's the cross of St. George at the top, and then natural landscape of the province. Rocky mountains, foothills, prairies, and wheat fields. There's wild roses on either side, our provincial flower. You can find it growing naturally all throughout our province, and even here in Edmonton in the River Valley. And then the very bottom of the coat of arms is our motto. It's in Latin. It says Fortis et Liber, which translates to strong and free, just like you hear in the Canadian national anthem. Does anyone have questions on doors or coat of arms? The most seats in the assembly. And we have their portraits on the wall to commemorate their time in office. And you can learn something about each premier by taking a look at the portraits, because they get to choose their own artist and also talk with them about symbols that they want to have incorporated. So we'll talk about some symbols that
Ito ay ini-explain niya lahat kasi may kahulugan na sa kanila. So kaya may tour guide. Yung kagaya nito, parang gaya ni Jose Rizal nila, yung mga heroes. Ayan.
Alright, so our portraits go
Kasi
back in
meron din
time
tayo
from more
sa
recent
ating
premiers
iba.
to the older ones. With the last portrait on the wall being the portrait of the Honourable Jim Prentice, who was Premier from 2014 to 2015. So you might notice that our current Premier and our past Premier don't have portraits on the wall. And there's a reason for this. It's because they're still MLAs, they're still in office. There used to be a superstition where it was bad luck to have your portrait hung on the wall before you actually left office. So because the two of them are still MLAs, they don't have their portraits up just yet. So the portraits do go back in time. The last one over there is the Honourable Jim Prentice, David Hancock, Alison Redford, Ed Stalmak, Premier Klein, Getty and Lougheed. They were all part of the same government, the Progressive Conservative government of Alberta, which were in office from 1971 all the way to 2015, which is 44 years, the longest serving government in all the provinces of Canada. And all the portraits have some symbolism in them in the more recent ones, so we're going to talk about some of that as we walk past. I like to point out the portrait of the Honourable Ed Stalmak because he's got a lot of that symbolism. He was the first Albertan Premier of Ukrainian heritage, and that was very important to him. There's a lot of people of Ukrainian descent here. So he's got the Ukrainian Easter egg, the Sanka in his portrait. His tie is also the color of the Ukrainian flag. But there's more symbolism, like in the background, there's a grain elevator that says Andrew, because he came from a small farm community in rural Alberta called Andrew. There's also coincidentally, both Premier Getty and Lougheed played football for the Edmonton football team. So before the Progressive Conservatives were in office, were the Social Credit Party of Alberta from 1935 to 1971. So that's Premier Strong, Manning, and Aberhart. You might recognize Manning's name from federal politics. He was the father of Preston Manning, the founder of the Reform Party. And Premier Aberhart, the first Premier of the Social Credit Party, also has some symbolism in his portrait that we'll talk about. So he's got a microphone and a Bible because before becoming Premier, he was a radio preacher as well as being principal. He had a show called Back to the Bible, so Premiers Reid, Brownlee, and Greenfield. And then the very first governing party in Alberta's history was the Liberal Party from 1905 to 1921. Premier Stewart, Sifton, and Rutherford. Now Rutherford, our first Premier, was a strong believer in public education, so he helped to found the University of Alberta. He was the first Minister of Education, and he has the Rutherford Scholarship named after him for high-achieving high school students in Alberta. Many people also credited him the rivalry between Edmonton and Calgary. Back when we first became a province, they had to choose where to put the provincial capital, and Rutherford was from Edmonton, so he argued strongly in favor of Edmonton. So Edmonton became the capital, although Calgary was the other large city at the time. So they were not too happy, but he told them in consolation, we'll put the provincial university south of the North Saskatchewan River. Which he did. He put the University of Alberta just south of the North Saskatchewan River here in Edmonton. So Calgary, of course, is not too happy about that, so that might be where the rivalry got started. We also have one more Premier's portrait on the wall, which is Premier Paul Taine just behind us there. We're going to take a look at an appointed position, and that is the Lieutenant Governor, whose office we are just outside. The Lieutenant Governor is the representative of the British Crown here in the province, like the Governor General before the provincial level. So Canada is a parliamentary democracy, but the Queen is still technically our head of state. So there's a role for her to play, but it's not very practical for the Queen to come over here to Alberta to visit ceremonies or go to events or give royal assent for bills. So the Lieutenant Governor does it on her behalf. The process of giving royal assent is probably the most prominent role of the Lieutenant Governor, where any law that is passed by the Chamber first has to be approved of by the Lieutenant Governor before it can be enacted. It's a largely ceremonial process, and all throughout the Commonwealth it's very rare for it to be denied. It's almost never going to happen, but it has happened once in Alberta's history, but not since the time. They're all wearing the same uniform. So this gold uniform with the braids in the middle and a sword and also a hat. We call it the civil half dress. It comes from British military tradition. And their uniform was made from real gold. It was very heavy and very expensive as well. About 11 or 19 karat gold. And lieutenant governors had to pay for their own uniforms. They did not come with the job. It was very expensive.
Yan din yung mga heroes nila. Katulad nung sa atin.
Yes, so you might notice that when we get to this portrait of the Honourable Ralph Steinhauer, he's not wearing the civil half dress, and there is a reason. He was Alberta and all of Canada's first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor, and he felt that the civil half dress uniform didn't represent him. he wanted to wear his chief's regalia instead. He was chief of Saddle Lake Creek First Nation, so he wore his chief's regalia instead, including the buckskin coat, beaded tie, and feathered headdress. I think it's also interesting to note that the Honourable Steinhauer is the only Lieutenant Governor pictured outdoors in his portrait. But since the Honourable Steinhauer and Lieutenant Governors have been able to choose what they want to wear for their duties, whatever they feel is the most appropriate. So some have worn business clothing, some have worn simple half dress again. The Honourable Helen Hunley, our first female Lieutenant Governor, wore a purple robe which is gifted to her, but now it's up to them to decide. Now we also have one other important symbol of the crown here in the province, and that's the mace, which we'll take a look at next. So feel free to come around the case so everybody can see. Alright, so this is the provincial mace. It's this long gold rod here. Now the mace is a very important symbol. It represents the authority to govern granted to the Assembly by the Crown. And every jurisdiction throughout the Commonwealth will have one, and they're all unique to the place that they're from. So if you go up to Nunavut, their mace has a narwhal's tusk in it, which is pretty cool. And Northwest Territories has like snowflakes, and ours has the wild rose and bison and our provincial crest. But the mace is such a powerful chamber, they cannot meet as a government.
Punta na tayo ng third floor. Ayan. Sa third floor tayo. Ito, nasa third floor na tayo. Ang ganun din. Now that we are a person. Yan tayo galing sa baba. Gallery. Very interesting.
Alright, well welcome everybody to the chamber. This is the heart of the building, and in my opinion it's the most interesting part because this is where everything happens. This is where new laws are introduced and debated and passed that affect our way of life in the province of Alberta. So Alberta has 87 MLAs, or members of legislative assemblies. They're elected from their section of desks, with the aisle behind him leading towards the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. On either side, the Premier sit the cabinet ministers. So they are government officials in charge of various portfolios under provincial jurisdiction, like education or transportation or healthcare. Now, across from them, sitting just in front of us here, is the opposition parties. So those are all of the parties that do not form government. Today, there's only one. It's the New Democratic Party with 23 seats in the Assembly. Their leader, the Honourable Rachel Notley, is called the leader of the official opposition because they have the second most number of seats. And she also sits in the very middle with an aisle behind her, sort of directly across from the Premier. There are also 3 independent members who sit on this section right here. They're not biased. Now, the Speaker is sort of like a referee or a moderator for debate. He is an elected member, but he's chosen from among them by secret ballot to hold the office of Speaker. And once he becomes Speaker, he has to be nonpartisan. So that means he has to be impartial. It's his job to make sure that the rules are applied fairly and consistently. So he uses the rules of the Assembly as well as parliamentary precedents to make sure that those rules are fair and consistent. But to help him out, because that's a very difficult job, there are some people in the there's 486, which is a lot.
486 daw na bumbilya.
And well, you might be wondering, why do we need all those light bulbs? There's 2 reasons. The first is because there's not a lot of natural light.
Nasa Canadian citizen yan.
Lights are on. It makes it a lot easier for the members to see.
Tandaan nyo.
But the second and far more interesting reason is because when this building was built, it was still relatively new to have a lot of electricity indoors. So the government may have added all those light bulbs just as a show of how much electricity the government of Alberta has, and they had to have their own power plant to run the building, which is still here in the river valleys. All right, we're gonna head to the 5th floor now, so you can follow me over.
Punta tayo sa pangilang floor? 5th floor. 5th floor. Wow, tingnan mo.
So these are the portraits of Queen Mary and King George V, who were the ruling monarchs when the building was built. So they used to be in the chamber in the place of Queen Elizabeth and King George, or Princess Philip down there. But if you look at King George's eyes and also his knees, as well as Queen Mary's, their eyes will appear to follow you when you walk past because they're painted in single point perspective. So when you walk this way, see if you can notice that. I think it looks a little bit creepy.
It's like moving. It's like moving. Really? Oo nga, sumusunod yung mata nila. Sumusunod yung mata nila. Ang galing naman. Oh, nandito na tayo sa 5th floor.
There's also the portraits of past speakers of the Assembly. And you'll notice they're all wearing the same uniform, just styled after a judge's court robes. Because when they're in the
Doon tayo kanina. The famous 5 Canadian Democrats.
So here we have the statues of the famous five, and they were 5 Alberta women who got Canadian women recognized constitutionally as persons. Prior to 1939, women were not considered people under the Constitution in Canada, which made it very challenging for them to be appointed to the Senate. So these 5 women set out to change it. They were lawyers. They took their case originally to the Supreme Court of Canada, but they were actually shot down. But at the time, the Supreme Court of Canada was not the highest court in the land. It was the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council. So they took their case instead there, and eventually the Privy Council ruled in their favor on October 18th, 1929, saying that women are indeed persons, and so that got them the ability to be appointed to the Senate. And October is also Persons' Day for that, October 18th. Alberta also had the first 2 women elected to a legislative assembly in the entire British Empire. That was Louise McKinney and Roberta McAdams. Louise McKinney was one of the famous 5. We also had the first woman to introduce a piece of legislation in the entire British Empire, which is pretty cool. We've also got people saying, well, legally you're not a person, I don't have to listen to what you have to say. And then she ran to the same challenge when she wanted to become senator. So she changed it, which I think is really awesome.
Gold yan. Yun sinabi ni Tom Guide namin. Mga
So the giant spot has a fountain down on the 7th floor. That fountain is not always there. It was installed in 1959, commemorating the first official visit of Queen Elizabeth II to our province. But when that fountain was added, and when it's on and the water is running, the sound from the fountain bounces off the grand staircase, off the roof, and then concentrates on this spot right here. So if you stand right here when the fountain is on, it sounds as if the water is directly above your head, like you're in a shower. So if you let that stand, just right on the gold eye.
Try it. What is it from? Yan. Parang umuulan daw. Yung manong trinay din.
Careful.
Parang yung iko niya sa ano. Tumatayo sila dyan pero feeling nila yung parang naanohan sila ng ano ng tubig. Lahat kami lumayo. It's like a magic.
They need to happen. It's just the way the marble cuts the sound. Yeah. Apparently somebody changing the marble and it works out.
Oh, ang galing.
Pipe is broken and very confused. There's no pipes up there, but I didn't realize it was stones. All right, well that concludes our tour, but thank you everybody so much for joining me. We're gonna head back down to the first floor now, so if we follow me.
Tagay na.
Ito yung mga in-explain niyo. Yan. Ito yung in-explain niya kanina. O yan. Ito rin yung pinuntahan natin. Ang interesting life are the most interesting time in Alberta history division. Yan, ito na.
Sí, creo que yo comentaba algo de eso también.
Tiene un comedor que se llamaba. Esto era de generación popular, se llamaba que iba dando las palabras sacando para que
Sí.
como hay que hacer.
Here we go. Nandito kami sa baba.
All right, if I could just get your line, please. So then the exit is just down the hallway. Okay. Thank you everybody so much. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Para allá.
Binalik na namin yung aming tour ID.
¿Una botella de agua? Esa la llevas.
Labas na tayo. Tapos na yung 1 hour din.
Yeah, I'm the one who put it there.
Free tours.
No problem.
Dito ang pasukan. Kaya lang ginagawa. Nire-renovate pa. Pinapaganda pa. O dyan. Dyan tayo galing. Mamaya sa harapan. Ano po. So, ito yung yung labas. Yung pinicture natin. So, dyan tayo sa loob pumunta. So, lahat ng video ko na yan, loob nun, loob. Ayan. Kailangan mapanood nyo yan. Meron akong question din dyan. Pero ang galing nila, no? Yung mga heroes natin, ganun din sila.
How many color we're talking about?
Mamaya mag-review tayo dito sa aking video. Nagtatanungan sila.
Alberta. This is Alberta.
Dito na kami sa car.